Good evening, everybody. Lovely to be back here on the final August in 2022 after what I think has been the most fabulous of summers. And yes, I love the sunshine and I love when it is warm. So we're all getting ready for back to school, back to college, or maybe not everybody is. Certainly, even if you don't have children, then there is an element of thinking about studying something new at this time of year. Often it's a bit fresh and exciting. I've written a separate article that is available on my website, not as a video recorded, all about healthy back to school packed lunches. For those that are interested, please go and check it out. I'm recording this at the end of August 2022. But tonight I want to talk about gluten. It's often come up. Lots of people will often talk about gluten. Some practitioners over the years have always said just absolutely avoid gluten. It's really bad for you. We are all sensitive and intolerant to it. I wanted to explore that a bit more tonight and look at the evidence, linking it, as I very often do, back to gut health and why there is this direct link between gluten, gut health, and the impact of health in the rest of the body. So what can I tell you about gluten, and why should we manage our intake of gluten carefully? Where do we find gluten, and how can we avoid it as best we can without necessarily having to completely and utterly exclude it from our diet? Now, what I want to talk about specifically here is about the gut barrier and something that you may have heard of and may not have heard of that's known as leaky gut. It's also known as intestinal permeability. There are medical people out there who will think this is rubbish, but there are studies that talk about intestinal permeability and leaky gut, and there are studies, quite a few of them now, which are talking more and more about gluten. Now, let's think about the gut barrier. What do we know? Well, we eat food. We know the gut is full of microbes. Many of them hopefully are beneficial, some of them are pathogenic. And what happens is, really, when you think about it, when you eat food, it is actually still separate to the rest of our body. So we've got this strong, or should have a strong functioning gut barrier, and food is passing through that we hope is going to be fully digested and broken down. And further down in the gut and in the colon, we get waste products passing through, either broken down toxins coming out of the body, passing back through the colon into our stools, or we've got the fibre and the waste that's coming through the leftover parts of our food, all passing down through the colon. Now, what should happen is, with a fully functioning gut barrier, it is separating what is happening in the gut from our body. You could say, in a way, it's external to the body, even though it's inside us. That's what a good functioning gut barrier is going to do. And wouldn't it be horrible to imagine that stuff that shouldn't get through from the gut, and that toxicity in any way, could somehow leach through into the bloodstream? It's sort of yucky, isn't it, to imagine that? And how could it possibly get through? And this is where some people would say this just does not happen. But this is where we talk about the gut barrier, gut integrity, leaky gut, and intestinal permeability. So just to explain a little bit more, and then I'll describe why gluten has such an important impact on this, is that the gut barrier should have sort of interlocking, overlapping cells with something that we call tight junctions that enables just completely broken down, fully digested food particles to pass through these really tiny gaps and get into our body and into the bloodstream, where they're taken on to be used by the body. And we're talking about amino acids from proteins, fatty acids and glycerol from fats, water, proteins, vitamins, minerals, phytonutrients. What have I forgotten? Yes, completely broken down carbohydrates, so simple sugars like glucose. Those are the substances that pass through. They provide the nutrients to feed our cells, provide energy to our body, help to repair cells, refresh tissues, etc. They keep us alive at the end of the day. Now, just imagine if those really tiny gaps that you couldn't see with the naked eye were able to get slightly wider. And this is where this concept of leaky gut comes into play. What happens is these tight junctions start to break down a little bit, and it does allow, you've got slight gaps that then allows not completely broken down food to pass through, sort of partially broken down protein molecules, and toxicity coming from the gut. For example, toxins from pathogenic bacteria can pass through into the gut. Now, what happens then is that this can give rise to symptoms in the body. For people who might get skin sensitivities and irritations, you might get headache, you may lack energy, brain fog. Now in more itchy skin, you might get a bit of inflammation. And in more serious conditions, there has been links between what is going on in the gut, this concept of leaky gut, and autoimmune conditions. So we can't separate what's going on in the gut from health conditions in the body, and this concept of leaky gut and intestinal permeability is certainly having a role to play in enabling things that are happening in the gut that we may not want to see, like dysbiosis, pathogenic bacteria overgrowth, impacting on health conditions and disease in the body. Now, where does gluten come into play in this concept? Well, studies, and there are numerous studies that back this up now, show that gluten enables these tight junctions to be broken down. There is a protein called zonulin, just a tiny bit of technicality here, but this protein called zonulin is released from these tight junctions, and you can test for this and look for zonulin in stool test results. But gluten enables zonulin to be released, and that is what's sort of pulling apart these tight junctions, enabling these gaps to appear, hence leaky gut, intestinal permeability. So what do we know then other than gluten and whether you should avoid it or not? So we know it can have an impact on these tight junctions, and it may not have the same impact for everybody. Some people may be more sensitive than others, but it is certainly something that does happen. We're all unique individuals, and I think we all have to have an understanding that you may have an identical diet to somebody else, but you're all going to react differently to it. So I think it's important to understand how gluten can have this impact on the gut, and to be aware of your intake of foods. Just to say, if you have been diagnosed with celiac disease, you will know that you absolutely 100% have to avoid anything containing gluten, or any foods, grains that have been processed in a factory that also produces gluten-rich grains. I'll come on and talk about these. Oats is not a gluten-rich grain, but often it is produced in a factory. Your porridge oats may be produced in a factory alongside wheat and other things that contain gluten, and therefore if you've got celiac disease, you really need to therefore avoid those sorts of oats, because there's an element of potential, a little bit of gluten finding its way through. And for those with celiac disease, just so you understand, and if you are a celiac, you will know this, it means that it damages the villi, actually. These are like finger-like projections in the small intestines, and this is what creates this massive surface area in the small intestines that enables the uptake of all those nutrients I talked about into the bloodstream. They become flattened if you've got celiac disease in response to gluten. Slightly different to the zonulin breakdown I spoke about. For those with celiac disease, your villi finger-like projections get flattened. It massively reduces that surface area for the uptake of nutrients, and very, very dangerous for nutrient uptake. You have to absolutely 100% avoid anything containing gluten for the rest of your life. It's serious. But for the rest of us, and for this leaky gut concept that I talked about, then what can you do to reduce your intake of gluten? I think the first thing that's very important is to understand where you find gluten. So I've got a list here. So we think about wheat, and wheat contains gluten, but are you also aware of all the other names for wheat? Now, by this, you may think these are sort of a little bit healthy, some of these, but we've got spelt, we have sourdough, we have durum wheat. You know, pasta's made with durum wheat. It still contains gluten. Semolina, couscous. People often think couscous is sort of a little bit healthy. It's no different. It's wheat at the end of the day. So be very, very careful with couscous. It's also found in grains rye and also in barley. You may not eat them very often, but you may think choosing a rye bread or rye vitas is a healthier option. But if you want to reduce your gluten intake, you need to be careful of those grains as well. Also be very careful if you're buying off the shelf sauces and soups, because wheat or these wheat products can often be used as thickeners in sauces and soups. So you need to read packaging very, very carefully. So what you need to do, therefore, is to keep a food diary for a week and just then reflect on that at the end of the week. You know, how often have you had anything with these gluten grains in? And for those of us that are not celiac people, I think we can separate oats. I don't include oats in this calculation because they do not contain gluten. As I said, it's very different for a celiac. Reflect on that. You know, look at what you've been eating, or maybe just look back in the past few days and seriously think about what you have eaten. And is gluten appearing every day? Is it appearing several times in the day? And how can you cut back on your intake? And just a few ideas for you. Think about gluten-free grains like millet, rice, quinoa. It's not really a grain, but it's like a grain, so I include it. So millet, rice, quinoa, buckwheat, confusing name, it's not wheat. So buckwheat's gluten-free. What else have I got down here? Amaranth and corn. So like tortilla chips, corn, they are gluten-free. Can you find ways, therefore, to avoid gluten when you're at home, so that if you're eating out, going to a friend's house, then you don't need to be quite so careful. And what you could do is, if you particularly want pasta, you could try a gluten-free pasta made from things like lentils or chickpeas. If you want a bread type product, maybe a wrap, have a look for ones that are made with sweet potato or with oats, for example. If you are really wanting to make a cake, but are thinking about a gluten-free alternative, I love cakes made with almond flour, especially something like a lemon drizzle. You can often get it made with almond flour with no wheat at all. That's really nice, but don't eat cake too often. And think about crackers and a particular brand that I love. They're a little bit like rice cakes. They may take a little bit of getting used to because rice cakes can be a little bit like cardboard. But Rude Health do a very, very nice range of crackers made with pulses like buckwheat and quinoa and lentils. So they're a very, very nice alternative to help you avoid the wheat and other grains, but you are eating something that is made to look like a cracker for convenience for you. So at the end of the day, as I often say within my posts, it's about moderation and avoiding things as best you can, hopefully by giving you this information, helping to educate you, understanding why gluten can be problematic to our gut and therefore give symptoms in the rest of the body. Will give you a little bit of motivation to help you choose some alternative gluten grains or avoid anything that's grain-like altogether. Actually, do you really, really need it? You know, maybe have a sweet potato rather than something that's grain-like. You know, do you need anything grainy with your lunch? Do you maybe just have a salad and make sure there's plenty of protein? Do you really need something that's got that starchy carbohydrate alongside it? Possibly not. But if you do, then look for those alternatives. Cut down, think about alternatives when you're at home. Don't worry so much about when you're out. Yes, by all means, try and avoid it. I was out yesterday, got caught out and ended up having a tuna melt toasty. Well, there you go. That's everything probably that I often say don't eat at all. But I was in a situation where there really wasn't anything else. I didn't beat myself up about it because I know I avoid these types of foods most of the time. You know, there it contained wheat and cheese, and I'm not a big eater of either of those. But, you know, on the odd occasion, for me, I think and I believe it is fine. But, you know, to take care of your gut as best you can, try and avoid an overload of gluten in your diet, because your gut will really thank you and the rest of your body will really thank you as well. So thank you for watching, and I will be back September, starting back to school. Autumn's fast approaching, but I'll be back next week. Please let me know if there are any topics that you'd like me to cover. I want to try and get into a routine of doing more gut related posts coming up. I know a lot of my followers are particularly interested in the gut health side of things, and it is my passion, and most of my client base is related to that. So I'm going to be drip feeding more content around that, particularly with my lives. But if there is anything else that you'd like me to cover, do let me know. And I look forward to seeing you on my lives in the Tuesdays going forward. Have a great week. Enjoy the rest of this summery weather. I think rain's on the way at the end of the week, but we do need it. But have a great week. Take care, everyone. Bye.